Plato's Republic, one of his works written by the ancient philosopher, he talks about a cave. And he tells this story about a cave, and he says it's like there's people who have been chained to the inside of this cave, and really all they can see as they're chained next to the wall is the back wall of the cave in front of them. But behind them is a fire that is blazing, and they every once in a while they get a glimpse of the shadows of people coming and going around behind them. So their whole existence, their whole understanding of reality is what they see in shadows on the wall in the depths of a cave. Now, Plato uses this to describe a couple things. One, he's a philosopher, and so he believes that philosophy is the greatest thing that we can attain to. And so he says, this is most people's lives. All we really see are the shadows on the cave wall. But what we don't realize is reality is outside of that cave. It's much brighter, it's much more real than what they see dancing around on the wall in the firelight. It's also a way he describes the soul as he understood it, that there's some kind of internal part of us, essence of us, that is more real than what is, as we would consider, real. And he tells this story about the cave, that one of them gets out of the chains and goes outside, and when he gets out there can hardly even open his eyes because of how he's used to the darkness, right? And he gets out there and he sees, and there's all these colors and there's all this brightness, and he realizes that the shadows that they thought were real were really just shadows, and the real people are outside, and he sees all of it and comes to terms with it finally, and he comes back to tell the others that are in the cave, and he tries to describe to them what real life is, and they think he's crazy. They don't want anything to do with what he's telling them. And Plato uses this to describe what he believes about life, that there is something more real within us. There's something more real. Now, he would tell you it's philosophy that will bring that out, but that there's something more than this reality that we experience. And honestly, in the church, we've really kind of adopted a lot of that understanding of what the soul means and what the soul is in us. We've really adopted that Greek philosophical understanding, this eternal essence of us that is inside, this kind of ghost essence that is me, but not this physical me. So when we read and we see the word soul, we typically understand it in that context, because that's impacted the way we think about soul. Well, we are in the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, right? We've been going through these words, and we learned last week about loving God with our heart and understanding that for us, our heart means our feelings, but for them, the heart included not just our feelings, but also our mind, our body, and our decisions. That when they said love God with your heart, it really encompassed all of those areas of who we are. So when Jesus then told this Shema, that when he was asked about the greatest commandment, he gave the Shema, but he gave it in a first century Roman context. And so he said not just love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, and your strength. He included your mind, because he knew that to the Hebrew people, when we said love God with our heart, that included our mind. But to the Romans, to the Greek philosophers, that was not the case. And so he translated that for them. So today we're continuing as we look at this. Love the Lord your God with all your soul. What does it mean to love with all of your soul? Well, the word I told the kids in Hebrew is called Nephesh. And the word Nephesh is found over 700 times in the Old Testament. 700 times. It's like 756 times, I think, is the actual number, that Nephesh is used. About 70 times it's used to be translated as soul. which means there's a whole lot of other words that nephesh is translated into in English. So what does it mean when we say love God with all of our nephesh? Let's check this out.
For thousands of years, every morning and evening, Jewish people have prayed these well-known words as a way of expressing their devotion to God. They're called the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. And as for you, you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your strength. We're going to look at the word soul. The Hebrew word is nephesh. It occurs over 700 times in the Old Testament. The common English translation of this word is soul, and that's kind of unfortunate. Here's why. The English word soul comes with lots of baggage from ancient Greek philosophy. It's the idea that the soul is a non-physical, immortal essence of a person that's contained or trapped in their body to be released at death. It's a ghost in the machine kind of idea. This notion is totally foreign to the Bible. It's not at all what nephesh means in biblical Hebrew. The most basic meaning of nephesh is throat. Like when the Israelites are wandering in the wilderness, they're hungry and thirsty, and they say to God, "We miss the cucumbers and melons we had in Egypt. Now our nephesh has dried up." Or when Joseph was hauled off into slavery in Egypt, his nephesh was put into iron shackles. But nephesh doesn't only mean throat. Since your whole life and body depend on what comes in and out of your throat, nephesh could also be used to refer to the whole person. Like in Genesis, there were 33 nephesh in Jacob's family, that is, 33 people. In the Torah, a murderer is called a nephesh slayer, and a kidnapper is called a nephesh thief. On the first pages of the Bible, both humans and animals are called a living nephesh, and if the life breath has left a human or animal, the nephesh remains. It's just called a dead nephesh, that is, a corpse. So, in the Bible, people don't have a nephesh, rather, they are a nephesh, a living, breathing, physical being. Now that might surprise you because most people assume the Bible says the soul is what survives apart from the body after death. And while the biblical authors do have a concept of people existing after death, waiting for their resurrection, they rarely talk about it. And when they do, they don't use the word nephesh. So even though nephesh is often translated as soul, the Hebrew word really refers to the whole human as a living physical organism. In fact, this is why biblical people can often use this word to refer to themselves. And it gets translated me or I. Like in Psalm 119, most translations read, "Let me live that I may praise you." In Hebrew, the poet literally says, "Let my nephesh live that it may praise you." By using nephesh, the poet emphasizes that their entire being, their life and their body, offer thanks to God. In the Song of Songs, the young woman constantly refers to her lover as the one my nephesh loves. And of course, love isn't just an intellectual experience, it's an emotion that activates your whole body, your entire nephesh. This helps us understand the brilliance of other biblical poets who could combine multiple meanings of nephesh in one place. Like in Psalm 42, we read, "As the deer pants for the water, so my nephesh pants after you. My nephesh thirsts for the living God." So, on a physical level, your throat can be thirsty, like a deer's, but then that physical thirst can become a metaphor for how your whole physical being longs to know and be known by your Creator. Which brings us all the way back to the Shema. To love God with all of your nephesh means to devote your whole physical existence to your Creator, the one who granted us these amazing bodies in the first place. It's about offering your entire being with all of its capabilities and limitations in the effort to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself. And that's the Hebrew word for soul.
So it's interesting when we begin to understand the way that the writers of the Bible understood what they were saying. It changes what we think. And so when we look at nephesh and we see that it is literally the throat, but a representation of the body, the fullness of who we are, our life itself. Last week we talked about how the heart represented the body along with the mind, the feelings, and the decision-making. We also talked, though, about there's some deeper feelings that the Hebrews would use, and they would talk about their guts. You remember that? That it was that the deepest emotion they believed came from their guts. And so in the Hebrew, a lot of times when talking about my inner self, the word is guts. And that's the term. And so we take kind of the base level of that word, and then we realize that in the context that they use it, oftentimes means something more. So the guts obviously are a physical, intestines is a part of your physical biology. But at the same time, to talk about guts was to talk about my innermost being, my deepest level. Just like today, we would talk about our heart when we talk about love and emotion towards people. Well, in this case, they take the word throat and they recognize in multiple contexts that it describes not just the physical throat, but our being, who we are. Not the ghost essence inside of us, but the fullness of who we are as God has made us. This word nephesh is used in lots of different ways. It's used and translated as life. Actually, it's translated most as life. It's also translated a lot as soul, as person, as spirit, as mind, as heart, as yourselves, as himself, as creature, and as themselves. Over and over again, it's used in all sorts of different ways, all describing who we are as people. I want to give you an example of kind of how we sometimes miss maybe what they were trying to say because of the way that we associate soul with a different thing. Psalm 23, it's a really recognizable, really common passage. The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul, right? My nephesh. He guides me along the right paths for his name's sake. Now think through that metaphor, okay? Now we listen to that, we read it at funerals a lot of times. We talk about this as somebody's favorite psalm, right? The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, is the way some of the translations say it. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. What's the metaphor? And the metaphor of Psalm 23 is, I am a sheep, right? The Lord is my shepherd. I am a sheep. So, the Lord is my shepherd, so I don't have to worry about anything because he takes care of me. I shall not want. He takes care of me. And then it says, he makes me lie down in green pastures. Isn't that what sheep do? They lie down in green pastures, right? He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my throat. You know, it's interesting when we think through the metaphor, it makes sense that it would say, he leads me beside quiet waters, he restores my nephesh. When I'm thirsty, my shepherd makes sure I have water to quench my thirst. Now, it is a metaphor. It is intending for us to understand that God is quenching more than just our physical thirst, that we're obviously not actually sheep, but that God takes care of us and he provides for us and he restores what is necessary for us. But when we say he restores my soul, it changes the metaphor a bit, especially if we understand soul to be something different than the Hebrews did. He refreshes my throat with waters. It sounds so spiritual when we say he restores my soul. When we think that he restores this ghost essence within me, this eternal thing that comes out when I die. But in reality, the writers were saying he restores all of me as he restores, as a shepherd would give water to a thirsty sheep. Another one, Psalm 42. We've read this one. We sang this one today. As the deer pants for streams of water, so my nephesh pants for you. What's the metaphor? As a deer pants for water because its throat is dry, so my throat longs for God. So my being longs for God. The metaphor of a thirsty deer and a thirsty person seeking out God. So we're called to love the Lord your God with all your nephesh. It means loving God with my entire being. my physical being, my life that has been given to me. It's the fullness of myself. While the heart includes kind of those specific things, my mind, my feelings, my decisions, my body, the nephesh really takes it a step further and says, my life, my everything God has made of me. You know what's interesting about this is when we think back to Genesis. You know, we have this soul discussion, sometimes even in church, and we think, okay, well, you know, what has a soul, what doesn't have a soul? We're thinking about this magic ghost thing that's within us, right? But the reality is, if we go back to Genesis at the very beginning of creation, when the first use of nephesh is actually in God's creation of animals. He created a nephesh. And those animals were described as a nephesh, a life that was created by God. And then he created humans. And what were they? They were a nephesh, a life that God created. So what's interesting is we sometimes think of the creation and we think, okay, well, you know, God created the animals and then he created us, and the thing that separates us is we have a soul and the animals don't. But the reality is the only thing that the writer of Genesis says separates us from the animals isn't some kind of ghost essence that's going to come out when we die. It's that God created us in his image. It was the image of God that separates us from the animals. It wasn't a soul, because in fact the word that we use as soul was used for the animals as much as it was used for us. So understanding nephesh this way, how do we love God with all our nephesh? I want to give you two quick examples. And they're just reminders of someone who maybe has done this in a way that seems pretty consistent. The first one is Joseph, son of Jacob. Remember Joseph? He was the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat kid, right? One of 12 brothers who was loved the most by his father, who was kind of arrogant and made them all mad, and they sold him into slavery. And he ended up in slavery, but because he was a good guy and because he tried to seek God and do what was right, he ended up being really kind of the head of the household for his master Potiphar, and really found himself rising through the ranks. And then he was falsely accused of assault on Potiphar's wife, and so he ends up in prison. But even in prison, he continues to what I would say is he continues to love God with his nephesh. He continues to live out his life for God. And so even in prison, he ends up kind of running the prison because he was trustworthy. Finally gets out of prison thanks to God giving him the ability to interpret some dreams. And he comes to Pharaoh, who has this terrible dream, and he's able to tell him, this is what this means, and you're going to need to prepare for famine because we're going to have some good years and then some bad years. And Pharaoh says, okay, cool, I'm going to make you the head of dealing with all of that. And now Joseph is second in command only to Pharaoh. Now his brothers come back after they had sold him into slavery. They initially were going to kill him. Now they come back, and you know he does some. He messes with them a bit. He tests them a bit to make sure that they're not the same guys that they were when he was young. But ultimately, this is what he says to them when he reveals himself to his brothers in Genesis 45. Then Joseph said to his brothers, come close to me. When they had done so, he said, I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there's been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household, and ruler of all Egypt. Joseph loved God with his nephesh, with his whole life. And so throughout his life, even though worst possible circumstances, over and over again, Joseph was the poster boy for why do bad things happen to good people, right? He was a good person consistently, and over again, just got the worst raw end of the deal, and yet continued to love God with his whole self, and God used him for great purposes for the sake of his people. One other quick example is Daniel. Again, a pretty well-known character, Daniel in the lion's den, right? But Daniel was taken to Babylon when his home country was defeated by Babylon, right? He was an Israelite. He was taken to Babylon. He goes and he becomes an advisor. They kind of take these young men from the conquered lands and make them into leaders, and that way they could lead their own people, but do so as Babylonians. So he's taken. And yet over and over again we see in the story of Daniel that he does not give up his love for God. He does not give up his offering of God, his whole nephesh. He instead remains faithful throughout. In fact, so much so, he doesn't want to eat the food that they offer him and works it out to where he can be faithful to God. He ends up serving multiple kings, and not only serving them, but like they love him. I mean, he builds relationships with these kings in a way that you would never expect a Hebrew man to do in this circumstance. But he does, and he serves all these kings to the point that they want him to do well. If you remember the lion's den story, it all happened because he continued to love God with all of him. When he was called not to pray to anyone but the king, he said, I love God with my whole life. I'm going to pray as I've always prayed. And then when he's taken to be thrown into the lion's den, the king doesn't even want to do it because he likes Daniel. But he does it because he has to. When he was told to choose the law over the love of God, Daniel chose to love God with his nephesh anyway. His life was stolen, had to go and to serve pagans, had to live far from home. He continued to love God with everything that he was. That's what we're called to do. It's not just love God with my soul, okay, some kind of my internal essence, whatever, however I want to. No, what he's saying is we need to love God with all of my life, my physical life, everything that God has created. You know, we have this idea that we are separate beings, spirit and flesh, soul and body, whatever, however we determine those things. The reality is the Hebrews saw it as we were created like this by God. Our body is a part of what God has created, our nephesh. And we are called to love him with all our soul, with all our nephesh. Hear, O people of God, the Lord is one. So love God with all your heart, meaning your body, your mind, your feelings, your decisions, and even love God with all your soul, your total and complete self. Give him everything that we are. Let's pray.